Hello, welcome to We Know Nothing, where we know absolutely nothing. And today in Sophie's world, we are going to go into chapter 4, The Natural Philosophers. If you haven't already, grab your book. Let's read along together. We're just going to go right in to chapter 4. The Natural Philosophers. Nothing can come from nothing. When her mother got home from work that afternoon, Sophie was sitting in the glider, pondering the possible connection between the philosophy course and Hilda Moeller-Nagg, who could not be getting a birthday card from her father. Her mother called from the other end of the garden. "Sophie, there's a letter for you." She caught her breath. She had already emptied the mailbox, so the letter had to be from the philosopher. What on earth would she say to her mother? "There's no stamp on it. It's probably a love letter." Sophie took the letter. "Aren't you going to open it?" She had to find an excuse. Have you ever heard of anyone opening a love letter with her mother looking over her shoulder? Let her mother think it was a love letter. Although it was embarrassing enough, it would be even worse if her mother found out that she was doing a correspondence course with a complete stranger, a philosopher who was playing hide and seek with her. It was one of the little white envelopes. When Sophie got upstairs to her room, she found 3 new questions. Is there a basic substance that everything else is made of? Can water turn into wine? How can earth and water produce a live frog? Sophie found the questions pretty stupid, but nevertheless, they kept buzzing around in her head all evening. She was still thinking about them at school the next day, examining them one by one. Could there be a basic substance that everything was made of? If there was some such substance, how could it suddenly turn into a flower or an elephant? The same objection applied to the question of whether water could turn into wine. Sophie knew the parable of how Jesus turned water into wine, but she had never taken it literally. And if Jesus really had turned water into wine, it was because it was a miracle, something that could not be done normally. Sophie knew there was a lot of water, but not only in wine, but in all other growing things. But even if a cucumber was 95% water, there must be something else in it as well, because a cucumber was a cucumber, not water. Then there was the question about the frog. Her philosophy teacher had this really weird thing about frogs. Sophie could possibly accept that a frog consisted of earth and water, in which case the earth must consist of more than one kind of substance. If the earth consisted of a lot of different substances, it was obviously possible that earth and water together could produce a frog. That is, if the earth and the water went via frog spawn and tadpoles. Because a frog could not just grow out of a cabbage patch, however much you watered it. When she got home from school that day, there was a fat envelope waiting for her in the mailbox. Sophie hid it in the den just as she had done the other days. The Philosophers' Project. Here we are again. We'll go directly to today's lesson without detours around white rabbits and the like. I'll outline very broadly the way people have thought about philosophy, from the ancient Greeks right up to our own day. But we'll take things in their correct order. Since some philosophers lived in a different age, and perhaps in a completely different culture from ours, it is a good idea to try and see what each philosopher's project is. By this I mean that we must try to grasp precisely what is that each particular philosopher is especially concerned with finding out. One philosopher might want to know how plants and animals came into being. Another might want to know whether there is a God or whether man has an immortal soul. Once we have determined what a particular philosopher's project is, it is easier to follow his line of thought, since no one philosopher concerns himself with the whole of philosophy. Let's take a little side note here, actually, about that every philosopher obviously is different. And I always think it's interesting that some really don't care about certain things. Some would rather know, like they said, how animals and humans came into being, rather than, is there a God? Even though those two things could be very connected in a way. But I like that philosophy doesn't just have a one-track way of thinking, I guess. You can think about literally anything you want. It doesn't have rules, which is very nice. But let's continue. I said his line of thought, referring to the philosopher, because this is also a story of men. Women of the past were subjugated both as females and as thinking beings, which is sad because a great deal of very important experience was lost as a result. It was not until this century that women really made their mark on the history of philosophy. I do not intend to give you any homework, no difficult math questions or anything like that, and conjugating English verbs is outside my sphere of interest. However, from time to time, I'll give you a short assignment. If you accept these conditions, we'll begin. Let's take another side note here about how women, they really did not get much of a voice throughout the centuries. And it is very sad that all that perspective was lost in history. Now, I've heard from some people that we should kind of just not even acknowledge a lot of history because it really was written by the most powerful people. It wasn't written by, your average Joe farmer. And so a lot of history is very tainted. It's not accurate. It's still definitely good to look back and see kind of what happened, but we don't really have the full picture, do we? We never really will have the full picture. So I'm hoping moving forward now that women do have a voice and, I don't know. I mean, we got the big corporations and governments and whatever, but I am hoping that we have more voices now to kind of try to portray a better depiction of what is going on in the present day for those in the future. But who knows? I mean, that might just be futile, pointless to even try. But let's continue here. The natural philosophers. The earliest Greek philosophers are sometimes called natural philosophers because they were mainly concerned with the natural world and its processes. We have already asked ourselves where everything comes from. Nowadays, a lot of people imagine that at some time something must have come from nothing. This idea was not so widespread among the Greeks. For one reason or another, they assumed that something had always existed. How everything could come from nothing was therefore not all-important question, the all-important. On the other hand, the Greeks marveled at how live fish could come from water, and huge trees and brilliantly colored flowers could come from the dead earth, not to mention how a baby could come from its mother's womb. The philosophers observed with their own eyes that nature was in a constant state of transformation. But how could such transformations occur? How could something change from being substance to being a living thing, for example? All the earliest philosophers share the belief that there had to be a certain basic substance at the root of all change. How they arrived at this idea is hard to say, but we only know that the notion gradually evolved that there must be a basic substance that was the hidden cause of all changes in nature. There had to be something that all things came from and returned to. For us, the most interesting part is actually not what solutions these earliest philosophers arrived at, but which questions they asked and what type of answer they were looking for. We are more interested in how they thought than in exactly what they thought. We know that they posed questions relating to the transformations they could observe in the physical world. They were looking for the underlying laws of nature. They wanted to understand what was happening around them without having to turn to the ancient myths. And most important, they wanted to understand the actual processes by studying nature itself. This was quite different from explaining thunder and lightning or winter and spring by telling stories about the gods. So philosophy gradually liberated itself from religion. We could say that the natural philosophers took the first step in the direction of scientific reasoning, thereby becoming the precursors of what was to become science. Only fragments have survived of what the natural philosophers said and wrote. What little we know is found in the writings of Aristotle, who lived 2 centuries later. He refers only to the conclusions the philosophers reached. so we do not always know by what paths they reached these conclusions. But what we do know enables us to establish that the earliest Greek philosophers' project concerned the question of a basic constituent, substance, and the changes in nature. 3 philosophers from Miletus? Excuse my terrible pronunciation of Greek names. The first philosopher we know of is Thales. I'm going to go with Thales, who came from Miletus, a Greek colony in Asia Minor. He traveled in many countries, including Egypt, where he is said to have calculated the height of a pyramid by measuring its shadow at the precise moment when the length of his own shadow was equal to his height. He is also said to have accurately predicted a solar eclipse in the year 585 BC. Thales, what did I even say before? Thales thought that the source of all things was water. We do not know exactly what he meant by that. He may have believed that all life originated from water, and that all life returns to water again when it dissolves. During his travels in Egypt, he must have observed how the crops began to grow as soon as the floods of the Nile receded from the land areas in the Nile Delta. Perhaps he also noticed that frogs and worms appeared whenever it had just been raining. It is likely that Thales thought about the way water turns to ice or vapor, and then turns back into water again. Thales is supposed to have said that all things are full of gods. What he meant by that, we can only surmise. Perhaps seeing how the black earth was the source of everything from flowers and crops and insects and cockroaches, he imagined that the earth was filled with tiny invisible life germs. One thing is certain, he was not talking about Homer's gods. The next philosopher we hear of is Anaximander, who also lived in Miletus at about the same time as Thales. He thought that our world was only one of a myriad of worlds that evolve and dissolve in something he called the boundless. It is not so easy to explain what he meant by the boundless, but it seems clear that he was not thinking of a known substance in the way that Thales had envisaged. Perhaps he meant that the substance, which is the source of all things, had to be something other than the things created, because all created things are limited. That which comes before and after them must be boundless. It is clear that this basic stuff could not be anything as ordinary as water. A third philosopher from Miletus was Anaximenes, from 570 to 526 BC. He thought that the source of all things must be air or vapor. Anaximenes was, of course, familiar with Thales' theory of water, but where does water come from? Anaximenes thought that water was condensed air. We observe that when it rains, water is pressed from the air. When water is pressed even more, it becomes earth, he thought. He may have seen how earth and sand were pressed out of melting ice. He also thought that fire was rarefied air. According to Anaximenes, air was therefore the origin of earth, water, and fire. It is not a far cry from water to the fruit of the earth. Perhaps Anaximenes thought that earth, air, and fire were all necessary to the creation of life, but that the source of all things was air or vapor. So like Thales, he thought that there must be an underlying substance that is the source of all natural change. Nothing can come from nothing. These 3 Milesian philosophers are believed in the existence of a single basic substance as the source of all things. But how can one substance suddenly change into something else? We can call this the problem of change. From about 500 BC, there was a group of philosophers in the Greek colony of Elea in southern Italy. These Eleatics were interested in this question. The most important of these philosophers was Parmenides, 540 to 480 BC. Parmenides thought that everything that exists had always existed. This idea was not alien to the Greeks. They took it more or less for granted that everything that existed in the world was everlasting. Nothing can come out of nothing, thought Parmenides. Parmenides. And nothing that exists can become nothing. But Parmenides took the idea further. He thought that there was no such thing as actual change. Nothing could become anything other than it was. Parmenides realized, of course, that nature is in a constant state of flux. He perceived this with his senses, that things changed, but he could not equate this with what his reason told him. When forced to choose between relying either on his senses or his reason, he chose reason. You know the expression, "I'll believe it when I see it"? But Parmenides didn't even believe things when he saw them. He believed that our senses give us an incorrect picture of the world, a picture that does not tally with our reason. As a philosopher, he saw it as his task to expose all forms of perceptual illusion. This unshakable faith in human reason is called rationalism. A rationalist is someone who believes that human reason is the primary source of our knowledge of the world. All things flow. A contemporary of Parmenides was Heraclitus, 540 to 480 BC, who was from Ephesus in Asia Minor. He thought that the constant change or flow was in fact the most basic characteristic of nature. We could perhaps say that Heraclitus had more faith in what he could perceive than Parmenides did. Everything flows, said Heraclitus. Everything is in constant flux and movement. Nothing is abiding. Therefore, we cannot step twice into the same river. Sorry, just let's take that for a second. We cannot step twice into the same river. Now, I know that seems very simple, yet it is so profound because a river is just constantly flowing. So when you step in it, because of the movement, you can't step in the exact same spot. The water's moving. Oh, it's so simple, yet, wow, blows the mind. I love that. See, I love simple things that are so incredibly deep. Ooh. Here we go. When I step into the river for the second time, neither I nor the river are the same. Heraclitus pointed out that the world is characterized by opposites. If we were never ill, we would not know what it was to be well. If we never knew hunger, we would take no pleasure in being full. If there were never any war, we would not appreciate peace. And if there were no winter, we could never see the spring. Both good and bad have their inevitable place in the order of things. Heraclitus believed, without this constant interplay of opposites, the world would cease to exist. God is day and night, winter and summer, war and peace, hunger and satiety. Can't say that word. He said. He used the term God, but he was clearly not referring to the gods of the mythology. To Heraclitus, God, or the deity, was something that embraced the whole world. Indeed, God could be seen most clearly in the constant transformations and contrasts of nature. Instead of the term God, Heraclitus often used the Greek word logos, meaning reason. Although we humans do not always think alike or have the same degree of reason, Heraclitus believed that there must be a kind of universal reason, guiding everything that happens in nature. This universal reason or universal law is something common to us all and something that everybody is guided by. And yet most people live by their individual reason, thought Heraclitus. In general, he despised his fellow beings. The opinions of most people, he said, are like the playthings of infants. So in the midst of all nature's constant flux and opposites, Heraclitus saw an entity or oneness. This something, which was the source of everything, he called God or Logos. I really appreciate that philosopher's view on the polarity of everything. We have to always take everything back to polarity because I feel like that's one of the most important concepts of the universe, essentially, is that the yin and the yang. There has to be dark in order to have light, light to have dark, hot, cold, just everything that's opposite, and then the poles, or the opposite poles, I should say, and everything in between. But there has to be those polar opposites. 4 basic elements. In one way, Parmenides and Heraclitus were the direct opposite of each other. Parmenides' reason made it clear that nothing could change. Heraclitus' sense perceptions made it equally clear that nature was in a constant state of change. Which of them was right? Should we let reason dictate, or should we rely on our senses? Parmenides and Heraclitus both say 2 things. Parmenides says that nothing can change, and that our sensory perceptions must therefore be unreliable. Heraclitus, on the other hand, says everything changes, all things flow, and that our sensory perceptions are reliable. Philosophers could hardly disagree more than that. But who was right? It fell to Empedocles, 490 to 430 BC, from Sicily, to lead the way out of the tangle they had gotten themselves into. He thought they were both right in one of their assertions, but wrong in the other. Empedocles found that the cause of their basic disagreement was that both philosophers had assumed the presence of only one element. If this were true, the gap between what reason dictates and what we can see with our own eyes would be unbridgeable. Water obviously cannot turn into a fish or a butterfly. In fact, water cannot change. Pure water will continue to be pure water. So Parmenides was right in holding that nothing changes. But at the same time, Empedocles agreed with Heraclitus that we must trust with the evidence of our senses. We must believe that what we see, and what we see is precisely that nature changes. Empedocles concluded that it was the idea of a single basic substance that had to be rejected. Neither water nor air alone can change into a rosebush or a butterfly. The source of nature cannot possibly be one single element. Empedocles believed that all in all, nature consisted of 4 elements, or roots as he termed them. These 4 roots were earth, air, fire, and water. All natural processes were due to the coming together and separating of these 4 elements. For all things were a mixture of earth, air, fire, and water, but in various proportions. When a flower or an animal dies, he said, the 4 elements separate again. We can register these changes with the naked eye, but earth, air, fire, and water remain everlasting, untouched by all the compounds of which they are a part. So it is not correct to say that everything changes. Basically, nothing changes. What happens is that the 4 elements are combined and separated, only to be combined again. We can make a comparison to painting. If a painter only has one color, red, for instance, he cannot paint green trees. But if he has yellow, red, blue, and black, he can paint in hundreds of different colors because he can mix them in varying proportions. An example from the kitchen illustrates the same thing. If I only have flour, I have to be a wizard to bake a cake. But if I have eggs, flour, milk, and sugar, then I can make any number of different cakes. It was not purely by chance that Empedocles chose earth, air, fire, and water as nature's roots. Other philosophers before him had tried to show that the primordial substance had to be either water, air, or fire. Thales and Anaximenes had pointed out that both water and air were essential elements in the physical world. The Greeks believed that fire was also essential. They observed, for example, the importance of the sun to all living things. They also knew that both animals and humans have body heat. Empedocles might have watched a piece of wood burning. Some things disintegrates. We hear it crackle and splutter. That is water. Something goes up in smoke. That is air. The fire we can see. Something also remains when the fire is extinguished. That is the ashes, or earth. After Empedocles' clarification of nature's transformations as the combination and dissolution of the 4 roots, something still remained to be explained. What makes these elements combine so that new life can occur? And what makes the mixture of, say, a flower dissolve again? Empedocles believed that there were two different forces at work in nature. He called them love and strife. Love binds things together and strife separates them. He distinguishes between substance and force. This is worth noting. Even today, scientists distinguish between elements and natural forces. Modern science holds that all natural processes can be explained as the interaction between different elements and various natural forces. Empedocles also raised the question of what happens when we perceive something. How can I see a flower, for example? What is it that happens? Have you ever thought about it, Sophie? Empedocles believed that the eyes consist of earth, air, fire, and water, just like everything else in nature. So the earth in my eye perceives what is of the earth in my surroundings. The air perceives what is of the air. The fire perceives what is of fire, and the water what is of water. Had my eyes lacked any of the four substances, I would not have seen all of nature. Something of everything in everything. Exagoras, 500 to 428 BC, was another philosopher who could not agree that one particular basic substance, water for instance, might be transformed into everything we see in the natural world. Nor could he accept that earth, air, fire, and water can be transformed into blood and bone. Exagoras held that nature is built up of an infinite number of minute particles invisible to the eye. Moreover, everything can be divided into even smaller parts. But even in the minutest parts, there are fragments of all other things. If skin and bone are not a transformation of something else, there must be also skin and bone, he thought, in the milk we drink and the food we eat. A couple of present-day examples can perhaps illustrate Exagoras' line of thinking. Modern laser technology can produce so-called holograms. If one of these holograms depicts a car, for example, and the hologram is fragmented, we will see a picture of the whole car even though we only have part of the hologram that showed the bumper. That is because the whole subject is present in every tiny part. In a sense, our bodies are built up in the same way. If I loosen a skin cell from my finger, the nucleus will contain not only the characteristics of my skin, the same cell will also reveal what kind of eyes I have, the color of my hair, the number and type of my fingers, and so on. Every cell of the human body carries a blueprint of the way the other cells are constructed. So there's something of everything in every single cell. The whole exists in each tiny part. Let's have a little side discussion here about that paragraph. That every single cell in your body, every single cell, is the blueprint for the makeup of your entire body, essentially. I mean, that is just so incredibly mind-blowing that just a tiny little cell connects to everything. And it goes to show that the very, very prominent theory that everything is connected, nothing can really be separated. You can't just take a cell and be like, poop, all right, that's nothing anymore. Because it is still you. It is still something of you. Woo! Woo! Really, really fun to think about. All right, let's go on here. Exagoras called these minuscule particles, which have something of everything in them, seeds. Remember that Empedocles thought that it was love that joined the elements together in whole bodies. Exagoras also imagined order as a kind of force, creating animals and humans, flowers and trees. He called this force mind or intelligence, nous. Exagoras is also interesting because he was the first philosopher we hear of in Athens. He was from Asia Minor, but he moved to Athens at the age of 40. He was later accused of atheism and was ultimately forced to leave the city. Among other things, he said that the sun was not a god, but a red-hot stone, bigger than the entire Peloponnesian Peninsula. Excuse my burp there. Exagoras was generally very interested in astronomy. He believed that all heavenly bodies were made up of the same substance as Earth. He reached this conclusion after studying a meteorite. This gave him the idea that there could be human life on other planets. He also pointed out that the moon was no light of its own. Its light comes from Earth, he said. He thought up an explanation for solar eclipses as well. Let's take it back also to the fact that he was basically banned from Athens for being accused of being an atheist. Imagine today, in this day and age, that you just completely get yeeted from your city just for not believing in something, or believing in something different, or just simply being an atheist, being whatever. I feel like that still happens in places today, for sure. I'm pretty sure it does, actually, in many countries. Or just in general in families on a smaller scale. Maybe they're very close-minded and they're like, well, if you don't believe what I believe, therefore you cannot be in this family and things like that. It's very unfortunate. Again, that fear creeps in with human beings fearing the unknown, fearing people who believe a different way, which, maybe one day we will all just be okay with believing different things. We shall see. P.S. Thank you for your attention, Sophie. It is not unlikely that you will need to read this chapter 2 or 3 times before you understand it all. But understanding will always require some effort. You probably wouldn't admire a friend who was good at everything if it cost her no effort. The best solution to the question of basic substance and the transformations in nature must wait until tomorrow, when you will meet Democritus. I'll say no more. Sophie sat in the den, looking out into the garden through a little hole in the dense thicket. She had to try and sort out her thoughts after all she had read. It was clear as daylight that plain water could never turn into anything other than ice or steam. Water couldn't even turn into a watermelon, because even watermelons consisted of more than just water. But she was only sure of that because that's what she had learned. Would she be absolutely certain, for example, that ice was only water if that wasn't what she had learned? At least she would have to have studied very closely how water froze to ice and melted again. Sophie tried once again to use her own common sense, and not to think about what she had learned from others. Forget everything you know. Parmenides had refused to accept the idea of change in any form, and the more she thought about it, the more she was convinced that, in a way, he had been right. His intelligence could not accept that something could suddenly transform itself into something completely different. It must have taken quite a bit of courage to come right out and say it, because it meant denying all the natural changes that people could see for themselves. Lots of people must have laughed at him. And Hippocrates must have been pretty smart too, when he proved that the world had to consist of more than one single substance. That made all the transformations of nature possible without anything actually changing. The old Greek philosopher had found out that just by reasoning. Of course, he had studied nature, but he didn't have the equipment to do chemical analysis the way scientists do nowadays. Sophie was not sure whether she really believed that the source of everything actually was earth, air, fire, and water. But after all, what did that matter? In principle, Hippocrates was right. The only way we can accept the transformations we can see with our own eyes, without losing our reason, is to admit that existence of more than one single basic substance. Sophie found philosophy doubly exciting because she was able to follow all the ideas by using her own common sense, without having to remember everything she had learned at school. She decided that philosophy was not something you can learn, but perhaps you can learn to think philosophically. Okay, end of chapter 4. That was, where was it? The Natural Philosophers. Quite a long chapter there, but very, very fun stuff to think about regarding different ideas, different philosophical ideas of, and it's nice to see that, it kind of starts off very basic. You just think of essentially basic things. Oh, well, it must be just air. Everything comes from air. No, actually, no, everything comes from water. Well, maybe we should combine those things. Everything comes from multiple things. And then the more you get into it and the more you get into it, you see that everything is starting to connect. It all is connected together. We're going back to that. It always, I feel like, circles back to everything is connected to everything. You have to have this in order to have this, polarity of it all. Fun though, the air, the elements, the 4 elements, air, fire, water, and earth. I said those in the wrong order, but I love that now we know the source of who thought about these four elements, right? Who was that exactly? Was that Empocles? Empocles? Well, one of those philosophers thought about the four elements. And it is true if you think about combining all of those in order to create the world around us. Because without everything, I mean, again, everything is connected. So fun to think about. But that is about it for chapter 4. Let me know in the comments what you think. Who's your favorite philosopher? I'd love to know. There are so many, and they all have fantastic ideas. So if you could take some time, leave a comment, subscribe, like, that would be fantastic. And I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you for joining.